totally okay.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Bem, boa vesprada, good afternoon, boa tarde. Muito obrigado, Marta. Avui continuem amb el cicle de seminaris de la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència dedicat a celebrar el 30 aniversari de la nostra societat. Presentar a la professora doctora Marta Lourenço és molt difícil. En primer lloc, per la seva generositat amb nosaltres, el que ha fet que participe en moltes de les nostres activitats els darrers anys. Per exemple, en 2020 va participar en el projecte d'entrevistes en temps de Covid, en el qual va parlar de com la pandèmia va afectar la forma en la qual els visitants es relacionaven amb els objectes dels museus i discutir sobre els límits de lo digital en l'àmbit de la museologia. En segon lloc, és difícil presentar a Marta Lourenço per la seva intensíssima activitat docent, investigadora i de gestió i direcció. No només és la directora del Museu Nacional d'Història de la Ciència de la Universidade de Lisboa i també investigadora del Centre Interuniversitari d'Història de la Ciència i la Tecnologia de Lisboa. També és la presidenta del Comitè Internacional de Museus i Col·leccions Universitàries, UMAC, de l'International Council of Museums, i va rebre l'any 2015 la prestigiosa medalla Sartron per la seva activitat en Història de la Ciència. Faré menció molt breument de només 3 dels seus projectes. Un d'ells és el projecte PRISC, Portuguese Research Infrastructure of Scientific Collections, on coordina un conjunt d'infraestructures dedicades a la investigació de col·leccions científiques per tot Portugal. En segon lloc, va dur a terme un extens projecte d'inventari, catalogació i estudi de tot el patrimoni cultural de la Universitat de Lisboa, que també va publicar. Finalment, recomana a tot el públic interessat en col·leccions la consulta de la pàgina web Tesaurus de Acervos Científicos en Língua Portuguesa, on, amb col·legues de Brasil, va crear una magnífica base de dades que integra 13 de les principals col·leccions d'ambdós països i que és un exemple per a altres projectes com ara Còmic, recolzat per la Societat Catalana d'Història de la Ciència. Finalment, és difícil ser neutral amb Marta Lourenço a causa de la seva generositat i la passió amb la qual treballa. Vaig tindre la sort de rebre l'ajuda de Marta durant la meva etapa postdoctoral a Lisboa, col·laborant en alguns dels seminaris i contagiant-me de la passió que transmet a totes les persones que treballem amb ella. Avui es presentarà un seminari titulat More Needed Than Ever, The Role of the History of Science in the Decolonizing the Museum Debate. Reflexionarà sobre una qüestió de plena actualitat en alguns dels museus internacionals més coneguts, però menys analitzada en els museus de ciència. Els objectes científics són fonamentals per a entendre una gran varietat de qüestions d'història de la ciència i al mateix temps és necessari que els historiadors de la ciència puguen debatre sobre aquesta qüestió amb els conservadors dels museus. Profesora Lourenço, cuando quiser, por favor, o micrófono é seu e muito obrigado. Vou partilhar o PDF agora. Bem, muito obrigado.
Okay, fantastic. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much, Inácio, Joseph Simon, Alphonse, and more generally, the Catalan Society for the History of Science and Technology. It's really a true honor to be here with you and participate in the commemoration of this 30th anniversary. As Inácio just said, many times in the past I've crossed paths with members of the Catalan Society, and in a way, the story of the last 30 years of, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, exactly. I think I can control too, right? Yeah, okay. So in a way, the story of these last 30 years of the Catalan community seems to mirror mine and vice versa, a continuous struggle, sometimes fight even, And I remember vividly how we collectively fought for the survival of my own museum in 2009 and the Lopes Pinheiro Institute in 2014, among so many collections of secondary schools and universities in Europe and Latin America. But as I was saying, a continuous struggle to raise awareness to the importance of scientific heritage for education, research, and culture, raise awareness among historians to collections, to museums, and material culture, both as objects and as sources of historical research. The paths that we have constructed together and the friendships that have resulted with so many historians of science in Catalonia makes this lecture really special for me and a true joy to be here. When Josep Simon wrote me, I really did not know what to talk about. Since I began directing the museum that I do not really do as much research as I wanted to, even the number of students that I supervise has diminished. So I thought about sharing some thoughts about the issue that has been concerning me the most since 2015, the year when the University of Lisbon inherited a massive legacy of scientific colonial collections and archives, and my museum became responsible for preserving, managing, and giving access. And more, I will tell you more about this in a minute. But I thought of sharing this legacy and also explore the connections with the history of science. Since we inherited these colonial collections at a time when museums were already decolonizing, we had less time than everyone else. You know, we felt that while everyone was decolonizing, we were actually colonizing. In any case, the experience is worth sharing, and I'm glad to do that. In the first part, I will briefly try to clarify the problematic. Then I will use a few examples from the collections to argue for the importance of historians of science. So what does decolonizing museums mean? Well, there's the use of the term decolonizing has been so used and abused that it practically means nothing today. You see here decolonizing I brought some examples: decolonizing dermatology, decolonizing fashion, and these are just a few. There's also one of my favorites, decolonizing light. This exists, obviously. And so, but in the museum, it is a term that has been mostly used. It's an Eurocentric term. In fact, I only realized this when I was talking to a Japanese curator in 2019 when we were in Kyoto for the ICOM General Conference. And that's when really the discussion about the museum definition became more salient. And he was telling me, this decolonization thing, it's all about Europe. It doesn't concern me. While his museum had, of course, Japan having been an imperial colony, had human remains and skeletons and skulls from all over Asian countries. So, but he felt that it was not implied in this discussion. So it's profoundly Eurocentric, the public debate. Also, in public debates, what I have witnessed, at least here in Portugal, is that the whole thing eventually boils down to issues of restitution, which to me seem to be or should be at the end of a line. It's highly politicized and tends to oscillate between extreme positions. The position of everything must be returned because the conditions were of oppression and suppression, so everything must be returned, between that position and the position of nothing should be returned. And there is still, I found, a great ignorance of the granularity of the problem, even among museum curators and directors. I've heard people whom I will not obviously identify, but I've heard things like Angola was ours when these objects came to the museum, so what's the problem? Or all our objects were collecting during scientific missions, so it was all in the, for the public good and the knowledge. No problem. For me, decolonizing the museum means bringing to light, giving visibility to voices that were suppressed for decades, if not centuries. Suppressed because they were considered inferior, not relevant, polluted, dirty. It's certainly about restitution, but not only in the returning and repatriation object sense. It's about the recognition and restitution of lost, hidden ideas and objects back into the center of museum curatorship, and from there to the public sphere. It is happening everywhere, but why is decolonization particularly difficult in museums? Because what we have in our museums, historic sites, collections, memorialize ugly pasts of our countries, and that is difficult to change. First, because changes directly challenge practices and ethics of former colleagues and go directly to the heart of our collective and individual identities as Portuguese, as Spanish, as British, as Dutch, as Europeans. Second, because whether you make changes or not, you are right there in the middle of politics, of alternation between pride and shame, left and right, multiple truths, misinformation, revisionism, a lot of emotions. Rigor is paramount, and so is transparency and collaboration with communities of origin. Historians are very important in raising the good questions and framing them through the proper contexts. That said, I think it's a fantastic time to be a museum professional in Europe. There is this feeling that everything is happening. In addition to the very interesting discussion about the museum definition in ICOM, it's incredible the quantity of reports, policies, papers, media articles, social networks, and webinars about museums and colonial questions. I brought some examples. I didn't overload the PowerPoint with references, but I have everything because of this reflection in Lisbon, and so if you want any of these documents, you can ask me, of course. So newspapers, some in Portuguese, also newspapers. This is a mainstream press. Meetings, conferences, seminars, with proceedings published. In Portugal, there has been quite a number of theses about colonial collections, not about science and empire. That's much more, and the universe. But this is specifically about the material culture of from colonial countries, and also policies. This is a very important document. For me, one of the references from South Africa about the value of repatriation of South African museum artifacts, which is it's one of the countries that I think recently has been appearing as it used to be Canada, it used to be Australia, but more recently South Africa has come up with really important research, case studies, and also some policies. And of course, universities have been taking the lead. Perhaps, I don't know why. I think that perhaps because they have a lot, number one. Secondly, because they are in a way more autonomous in decision making than other museums, national museums, municipal museums. And so they've been taking the lead both in terms of being transparent about what they have, but also in issues of repatriation. For example, we have here the University of Aberdeen in the UK, the University of Manchester, which actually won a UMAC award in 2000, I think, second place, I think in 2019, it was before COVID. And also the ULB, but there's more. There's ULB, Université Libre de Bruxelles, also has a policy. So many universities are looking for policies. There's also the Coimbra group. I think I didn't, maybe it was before. Yeah, there is an important document on your right side of the Coimbra group, which is the consortium of old universities in Europe. They have issued some guidelines. And so universities are really leading the way in many respects, in terms of research and in terms of policies. UMAC, also to mention that we had for 2 years internal discussion and also with members. And it was one of the highlights of our last annual conference, which was held online with the Universium. Universium is the European Academic Heritage Network. And we produced some guidance, some guidelines for restitution and return of items from university, museums, and collections that is accessible in our website, as well as the debate that resulted in those guidelines. So in a way, I think that in a way this is not a new issue in museums. Since the 1960s and 1970s, particularly in the Americas, there have been growing movements of inclusion and education, and in Latin America, particularly before and after the Declaration of Santiago of Chile, and that was in 1972. So this year, 50 years of the declaration, there's been a raising awareness and activism towards the social role of museums, the role of museums in economic development, and the engagement of populations, also in Portugal and Spain in the late 1970s after the implementation of democracy. So it's not new, and in Europe, I think we have a lot to learn from these movements, the new museology movements and the eco-museology movements of the past 50 to 60 years. The right to heritage, to identity, to memory, whether in its materiality, the objects, or immateriality, the narratives, is an integral part of human rights. This directly challenges museums of all types and sizes to commit to social justice, to equality and universal access. What are the differences, the main differences between today and the movements and the 1970s, late 1960s and the 1970s movement? I think there are two main differences. The first is that focusing on the colonial, the movements naturally reach Europe, as my friend, the Japanese curator, said, and encompass all museums and encompass the museum institution en tant que tel. The second is that the movements are centripetal. In other words, they come from the outside, not from inside, not from museum professionals. They come from the people. People do not see themselves represented in museums. They think that they act as an elite institution that reinforces inequalities at local and global level between North and South, and demand that things change. And these differences have also updated, in a way, the debates and the practices in Latin America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and also South Africa, and so many other countries in the so-called New World, which were already an example for us in Europe with regard to indigenous peoples' issues and First Nations. In this context, I think that scientific collections and heritage offer interesting perspectives to these new debates. Let me explain why. The first is that the dimension of this heritage is enormous. As we know, largely unknown. It's the dark matter and accessible sometimes only to restricted circles, still, unfortunately. A large proportion are outside the museum institution as such, in universities, in schools, etc. They are largely outside the decolonization debate, which is circumscribed mostly to museums, and mostly to museums of art, of ethnography and archaeology, although now we see the issues of scientific heritage being more discussed in the community, the museum professional community. And so they have been outside these debates. The second reason is that what we call the documentation practices of museums, so in the museological sense, not in the historical sense, are not necessarily the same as in museum, as museological. What we call the documentation practices are not museological practices, neither in time, nor in form, nor in substance. And that is neither bad or good, it's just the way it is. We should not assume that we will find metadata of museological nature. We will mostly not. The metadata we find are discipline-oriented and history of the discipline-oriented. Scientific collections encapsulate practices, contexts, and ethics of research and teaching at the moment of collecting. We need historians to provide them with a full extent and thickness of their meanings. The third is that scientific collections, unless they are a museum, are not bound by the ICOM Code of Ethics, for example. Not only that, there is sometimes conflict between deontological practices in scientific collections and in the Code of Ethics of museums. I'll give you an example. For a medical collection, a pathological collection, an anatomic collection, the anonymity of the human being is an absolute value of medical deontological practices of research and teaching. In museums, it's exactly the opposite. So a skeleton is a person with a life and a name. It must be stored, preserved, and given access with the utmost dignity. So when these study or teaching collections of human anatomy or human pathological anatomy enter the museum, they may cause a problem if certain premises are not guaranteed. I can explain this a little bit more if you are interested. Finally, the fourth is that it is easier to associate, sorry, there's something happening. Okay, my computer started running the antivirus. It is easier to associate significance and values of memory, identity, with an archaeological or an ethnographic artifact than with a dinosaur or a mineral or a plant. It's something more fluid in terms of what is, in fact, scientific heritage poses a problem for exactly the same reason. Within the context of cultural heritage, it has never been properly defined for the same reason, because cultural heritage is anchored in values of identity and memory, and it's very difficult to do that with naturalia, and even more difficult with artificialia, because if we think, for example, of a scientific instrument that was made in Spain, say, what does that have to do with Spanish identity? It's not something, say, a theodolite or a telescope. It's something interesting, fascinating, in fact. So let's go to concrete examples, because I think it's better to tell you about, you know, the progress we have made with the examples of the colonial collections we have, and then enter some discussion. And also, I may raise the questions for which I don't know the answers, right? But I'm going to share them with you. So around August 2015, we have received, by decision of the government in the University of Lisbon, a significant number, in fact, the scientific colonial collections that existed in Portugal, the official ones, because of course universities have colonial collections because they developed missions in former Portuguese colonies, but the state as such, the country, the nation Portugal, created in the 1850s, a mission, a sort of a structure, governmental structure, in order to implement cartographic, zoological, botanical missions in the colonies. So this is more a political arm, not so much a research arm as the collections of the universities. And so after the decolonization of the country, in 1974, after a brutal colonial war and the movements of resistance, democracy was implemented in Portugal. Salazar resisted for decades to give Portuguese former colonies the right to self-determination. So we're talking about Angola, we're talking about Mozambique, we're talking about Guinea-Bissau, Timor, some territories in India, and what else? São Tomé and Príncipe, the archipelago, and Cape Verde. So there were first cartographic missions, and then those missions were enlarged to every science you can imagine. So what are these collections? They are collections of herbaria, for example, ethnographic artifacts, cartography, and all the associated data, of course, photography, scientific instruments and equipment, geology. For example, you have a collection of soils, which is the one that's very beautiful there with those lines. It's a collected samples of soils from Angola. And so we're talking about 1 million objects, which for us was a lot, 7 kilometers of documents, manuscripts, maps, etc., the majority from the 20th century, and 1 botanical garden, the tropical botanical garden. These are joint collections that we had in the university, resulting from research missions to former colonies, but I mean, in comparison, it's nothing in terms of quantity and quality. Nothing can be compared. It was really a massive legacy, which was not necessarily accompanied by the necessary resources, both in terms of financial resources and in terms of human resources. But that's another story. So we immediately felt the institutional responsibility of inheriting. By the way, the institute that was called, the name of the institute was Tropical Research Institute, IICT, in Portuguese. And there were similar institutes all over Europe. You know, there was the Tropen Institute in the Netherlands and so on. So we immediately felt this institutional responsibility. As I said, the debate was already quite active about colonial collections and the role of museums. And so we had, fortunately, a wonderful team at the museum, and we adopted from the literature that was already also significant, a checklist that we have been using and that I will share with you because it allows us to, you know, follow the path that we briefly, right? Follow the path that we took. This was a large team of people that not only me, of course, but I coordinated, and I'm trying to write a book about this. I will eventually one day write a book about all this process. So the first thing we did was to examine our values and attitudes towards this legacy, right? So without any preconceived ideas about whatever, with total openness, interest, and curiosity also about what we were going to find, believing in what I said at the beginning, that heritage is a right, a universal right of everyone, and not only of a small elite, that museums are transforming forces in society, and that restitution of access to communities of origin is a factor of inclusion, equality, social justice, and is part of our obligations, duties, responsibilities. So while we were incorporating all those, you know, hundreds of objects in the university, we were going through them. And at the same time, we were making sure that even if they were in boxes because they were being moved around from different places in Lisbon, that there was always access, especially more access even than the access that was before in the Institute. So that was very, very important for us. There were, of course, some investment, and that was very good. One of the things that we did initially was to restore the tropical botanic garden. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. I'll show you some photos because it's always better to talk with photos. And after those values and attitudes were clear, which is not something easy, you can guess, but we started doing what is called provenance research, so to examine legal and moral ownership. And this is a very important distinction that appears everywhere. You may have the legal documents that justify ownership, but you may not have moral ownership. You may not be entitled to it. It depends on the circumstances of the collecting. It's important to note that provenance research already existed in museums, but it was more associated with attribution. You know, when you want to identify the author, for example, of a painting or a sculpture, mostly paintings, you want to, you know, to attribute authorship and say it's a Picasso, it's really a Picasso. So it's very much connected with connoisseurship. So it's not necessarily with history and with historical research. And this provenance research requires that you define a geographical scope, a time scope. In our case, it was, 19th century until 1974, say. So, and then go through every object and look for the documentation, manuscripts in terms of documentation in the historical sense, associated with that object. Not only manuscripts, okay? Iconography also, prints and maps, whatever, everything. So it's a massive, massive work. And then you have to look at everything that you gathered and first of all, identify problematic objects because they will appear. I will come back to this topic in a minute. We identified 3 or 4 major problematic collections. And you also want to do something which is quite difficult, which is to establish a connection between one object and a document, which is quite difficult because, you know, there was a mission and then there was a list of objects that was sent to Lisbon, say from Mozambique. But the detail of that list, which is a transport list, you know, it's not so much, it doesn't allow sometimes for the identification of the object, a clear identification of the object. Another issue that's very important in provenance research is that, okay, so what are you going to consider? Are you going to, in terms of time scope? Yes, okay, Portugal had colonies since 19th century, it even had before, but we were only concerned with this time frame of this institute, also of this collection. And do you want to know also other aspects, for example, were the objects collected in times of the colonial war, in times of war, because that's an important dimension in terms of guidelines. Everyone knows, or at least, you know, museum professionals know that they cannot incorporate, they cannot access objects that come from countries where there's war. But would that extend to the former colonies when they were at war with Portugal, which is more or less between 1962 and 1974. So would we consider that too? And those objects collected there different from the objects collected, all things being equal, in a different period. So there's several issues also that we need to consider in this provenance research. So there's a set of criteria that we hope to publish, we'll see. But there's also identification of everything that is sacred, iconic, symbolic, also typologies of sensitive objects, for example, archaeological, ethnographic, human remains, representations of the human, for example, in photography, sovereignty data, anthropometric, clinical, personal data. And yeah, there are also other dates. I'm not going into detail, it's getting too technical, but also the way that the objects were collected. Was it a donation? Was it an acquisition? Was it a mission? Because missions also involved donations and acquisitions. Who were the people who collected? Was it scientists? Was it military? Was it official colonial agents? I mean, all that, we did a big table and we did it object, collection per collection first, and then object by object. We finished last September. Of course, this is a matter that I do not think the issues that it raises, the questions that need to be asked, and the sources that need to be critically analyzed require, I do not think that curators are necessarily prepared to do this alone, and they need historians and also communities of origin. I'll get more into that in a minute. I want to tell you about the problems that we identified. We identified 3 problematic collections, which a collection of photography, of a few photographs, not many, but some 40, 50 photographs that I will not show you. In fact, I will not show anyone. It's just incredible. So that those photographs existed. Then another problematic collection was a collection of archives, data, raw data of cartography of all of Africa, and then a collection of human remains, blood samples. We don't have skeletons, we don't have colonial skeletons, we don't have colonial skulls, because the recommendations is for return, unconditional return of those specimens. We don't have that, but we have 16,000 blood samples. I will show you photos in a minute. So at the same time that we're doing this, we need to retrieve and reconnect indigenous and historical knowledge. I think is more trivial for this audience, but we need to establish the connections that were lost, because a plant that is collected goes to a general herbaria, but then if it's used, if it has a human use or economic use, it may go, part of the plant may go to another collection, which is typically called economic botany collection, or ethnobotany. So we need to, and that is totally disconnected in terms of data, of information, and needs to be reconnected, and sometimes needs to be resignified with the help of communities of origin. And of course, during the whole process, universal and open access, promote research and exhibitions, engage with communities of origin, and don't talk, only act. I think it's important. One of the examples, I don't know, Ignacio, how am I? Half an hour? 40 minutes?
Yes, more or less. Yes, Marta, feel free.
Okay, I'm just...
Yes, because we start 10 minutes later, so it's fine. 20 minutes is very fine, yes. 15,
it's 20 minutes, okay. 15, okay,
or 15,
very good.
Or 15, you are right.
Okay, very good, very good. So let me show you, for example, one of the things that we had was problematic, and there has actually been some research about it. I forgot to give a reference, but then Sophia, oh God, forgot the last name. She studies in the Netherlands, but it will come, the name will come. And she did a master thesis about this collection of busts representing indigenous peoples from former Portuguese colonies, and they were in the tropical botanical garden. And not only our garden, and not only scientific collections sometimes have only this scientific dimension. It's the way they are. Yeah, Sophia Lovegrove. Thank you, Luciana Martins. Of course. Yeah, Sophia Lovegrove did a wonderful job problematizing this garden, and in particular the collection of busts. And we've been working with her. She's been wonderful, helping us give more meanings to the garden. But a scientific collection sometimes only have the layer of science, Western science, whereas everything that happened, context, history, and so on, it was not is not considered. It's just the name, scientific name of the plant goes to the herbarium. If it has applications, it goes to the ethnobotany collection, and that's it. And even the labels that you see in a botanical garden, you don't see anything that is historical, so to speak. And so one of the things that we did immediately was to resignify, first of all, give it the statue of an object, being give the busts the statue of objects, the statute of objects, a collection that were catalogued and labeled. So these are new labels, and also the garden only had a botanic dimension of enjoyment by the public, and it started having an historical parcours, a route of history, especially because the history of this garden is a history of suffering, and a history where we had, we Portuguese, we had a human zoo in 1940 in the context of an exhibition, which I will not talk about. It's very well described in. There's been a lot of research also about this. In any case, there was absolutely nothing in the garden to indicate the small lake is still there, but there was absolutely nothing indicated that there had been a human zoo. So this was one of the first measures that we did, to provide this thickness of I'm not satisfied with it. I still think we need to do more. We need to put some photos. We have the label, but yeah, it's not enough. We need to do more, and we need to acknowledge more the suffering of the peoples who were there. So, but this layer is very common in scientific collections, museums, and heritage. It's just that it's flat. It's science. It's all about the science, and the rest is not done. Another thing that we did was to put everything in the public dimension, the public sphere. This was a scientific collections of an institute, so they had never been, well, occasionally, but not systematically. They have never been displayed to the public. And so we started doing a program of exhibitions where we show that these collections exist and that they have these stories and they have these pasts, and we've been doing that mostly with some communities, especially the jazz. I saw Cristina Luis, she knows a little bit. Some people who are attending know a little bit what we've been doing. I think it's not enough. I think, for example, it's interesting to work with associations representative of the communities of origin, but it's much more interesting to work with communities of origin and not only the representatives, because most museums, they don't have access to communities that are in Portugal or whatever. And so they use these associations to reach out to those communities. The idea of reaching out is already a bit centered in ourselves, but it's not the same thing to work, because representatives, associations are already an elite among the communities of origin. So it is problematic. What did I want to say more? Yeah, stimulating research. So I think I already mentioned that. There's been some studies that have been in this new, of course, there's been research, about these collections for a long time, but in these new perspectives, perspectives of resignification and restitution of lost practices, lost information. And I think I will now talk about the two cases that I will not talk about the photos, but I will talk about the blood samples. So this is a collection of blood samples. So typically what happened is that you would put a needle in a finger, and then you would have the print with oh yeah, start at the point. Okay, can you see my mouse?
No, okay. The mouse, no.
You cannot see the mouse, okay. So, but you see that these are racial studies. These studies that wanted to demonstrate the supremacy of European. They were common in many places. What I found particularly interesting and worth questioning is that this was done very late. Okay, so these studies were done in this collection of 16,000 blood samples was made in the late 60s, 70s, throughout the 70s. And I think that, you know, apart from legal issues conditioning access, such as personal data you see there, and clinical data, and moral issues also, because blood samples are human remains. Should we keep them? Should we return them? So there's all that debate. Why were Portuguese anthropologists doing race studies in the 60s and 1970s when everyone else had stopped? Perhaps South Africa was doing race studies at the time. So this is clearly a question that can only be answered, or that should be answered, of course, by the historians of anthropology, but in any case, by historians. I think it's there are questions that we don't. I mean, it deserves. It was studied. This collection was studied by Ricardo Roque from the Institute of Social Sciences, which probably he published a recent paper in 2019 called "The Blood That Remains: Card Collections from the Colonial Anthropological Missions." But still, we need to work with historians to critically examine the pertinence, right, the relevance of the time frame that these studies were done. Another example that I was very, very impressed during the provenance research that we did, there was two things. So we did the provenance research, but at the same time, because I was being responsible for the whole coordinating all the accession process, I asked that all the requests for access from any researcher to be directed to me, because I also I found that it would be a nice way to know the collections. And one day I received a request from an Angolan. He was a technician from the Institute of Hydrography, I think, from Luanda, and he wanted to have access to data about raw data, so primary information about a section of their frontiers, the frontiers of the Angola map. So the Angola maps already exist. They were done. Cartography was done. The maps are great. They have been accepted. There are some issues with territories that are claimed by different countries, but in any case, the maps exist. But this researcher or technician wanted access to the primary data. And I was stunned. Frankly, I never expected that an Angolan had to come to Lisbon to have access to the data of their own primary data of their own frontiers. And then I started asking, yeah, well, where is the primary data of other surveys, cartographic surveys that were done elsewhere, say, French former colonies, or Indonesia? The Dutch did the cartography of Indonesia. Where is the primary data, and who should own it? And I think, for instance, in principle, it's in the archives. So we are eccentricity here, because in principle should be the National Archives. But because this is all connected, the missions, the cartographic missions had the instruments, the photography, the collecting of also zoology samples, etc. And the integral nature of this heritage made that these archives have stayed with the other collections. So we own them. But for me, this is highly problematic that we have them, because I don't think that is right for the communities of origin to come to Lisbon, to the former colony, to ask even asking for me makes me uncomfortable. So I think that this is one of the documents that we should return unconditionally. Now, whether it's originals or digitalizations, that's, that should be discussed eventually. But it's something that raised, and it's not what is discussed in the normal debates about decolonization, which are much more centered in issues of human remains, certainly, but issues of symbolism, of the sacred, the ritual, and so on. So I think that scientific collections have much more things that have not been, or they have been until now, under the radar of these debates. So to conclude, I think that these collections are bridges between geographically dislocated communities, between the past and present, and between shared memories, histories, and identities. I think decolonizing scientific collections is about including and reconnecting the material evidence of European research displaced in the name of science, but really with purposes of exploitation, sharing with the communities of origin, from enriching the stories about objects and specimens in co-curatorship to complete restitution to former colonial countries. There is an enormous spectrum of questions to be raised and work to be done. Often curators in scientific collections and museums are not entirely prepared to raise those questions and to do that work. The contribution of historians is particularly interesting, namely, and I summarize now, in the complex analysis of ugly and difficult pasts, particularly issues of pertinence, timeliness, and context, in the provenance research, where you have to confront material sources and documental sources, in the confronting of emotions, in the retrieval of lost secondary indigenous information, and historiographical rigor, particular critical analysis of sources, archive. And in fact, I'm aware of the irony here, because I've been, for the past 20 years, trying to convince historians to come to the museum because of the importance of material sources. And now what I'm calling is for the most basic, so to speak, skills of historians, which is in their competence of context and competence of analyzing, examining sources. So it's ironic, but yeah, still I'm trying to bring historians to the museum, which I think is a good thing. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado, moltes gràcies, Marta, for this excellent seminar, which deals with museology, science, but also responsibility, morality, and the values of democracy and science itself. So now, people, all of you are invited to, we have some minutes, you are invited to ask Marta different questions. So you can use your microphone, or you can send the question by the chat, and then we will read it for Marta.
Yeah, I wanted to stop the sharing, but I couldn't.
Yeah, I think I do it. I
Okay.
did it. Yes. So in the meanwhile, I have one question. Perhaps people always needs a couple of minutes to reflect, to digest all the ideas and all the points. And my question, I don't know if it's a little bit difficult or not. It's about the how the decolonizing debate is affected by two challenges. The first challenge is a Portuguese and also a Spanish one relating to dictatorship, because in our case the both debates are together, no, in contrast to the collection of the United Kingdom, or France, or or Germany? This is the first question. How both debates are integrated or merged. And the second debate is how the debate on scientific collection, on decolonizing scientific collection, affects to the popular understand one idea that is very popular, no, that science is neutral, and challenge that idea. What are your points or your reflection about that, Marta?
Well, the dictatorship issue, I think that it clearly had an impact, at least in the duration of the colonial. So we had more time. In Portugal only, I mean, the decolonization in terms of country only happened in 1976. And there was a prolonged colonial war. There were movements of resistance. And okay, France also had the Algerian War, but war is an issue that is more common. But I think that the most salient impact is really we had colonies more time until later. In terms of science, neutral, yeah, of course not. But we have a lot of studies. We don't need collections to tell us that, right? So we don't need museums. But yeah, but collections also encapsulate. They reaffirm the fact that science is not neutral. Museums are not neutral. And what I think that's particularly difficult is this extreme polarizations thing that I mentioned, that between the shame and the pride, and then the extreme right in Europe is, hijacking all these debates, and then there's the left also. So it's difficult sometimes to handle. Yeah, we're in the center of politics, but it's difficult sometimes to handle the public debate, I think. Although I think we need to be transparent, but we don't want to be. I don't think that we want to be positioned or clustered in one of these extreme positions, which are so easy to see in our in our social networks and media and so on.
Yes, please, Pep.
Hello, Pep.
Hello, Marta. I wanted to ask you about, you've talked mainly about doing research in the museum, and this is very important, and the work of historians also going more to the museum, etc. But what about the exhibiting? And how do you see the opportunities or the difficulties? Museum environments are very different in different places, and for instance, I think that we can see from Spain that the colonial debate is much more present. Probably it's imperfect, but it's much more present in Portugal than in Spain. But I don't know if you can talk us about experiences, for instance, in Portugal, about exhibiting this colonial heritage and how it would be possible, or the aspects you've talked about could be channeled into exhibitions or not. And the other question is related to the international context. I mean, as you have a lot of experience in UMAC and different international organizations, how do you see the role of these international organizations and the possibilities in order to build this cooperation that you were talking about with countries that have remains, that have this colonial relationship, etc.?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. I think that I cannot think of exhibitions disconnected from research. I have this default, thing that you only really have good stories if you have good, research that, make them visible. because these objects have participated in so many quests, you know, and so many cycles. They themselves had life cycles and so on. So you only think of, you don't display for display. You think of research, and then you think. So naturally, for me, if historians are involved in the research, they will be naturally involved in the display part. But I think that these collections should not be displayed without the participation of communities of origin, okay? Because we have to think that there's a delta, there is a delta between, there's a gap between what we have and what we should have, because we didn't collect, because we ignored, because we thought it was inferior, and so on. So there is this correction factor that we need to do, and we need to do it with community. So historians are super important because of context. If it was just botanists, probably the issues would not be raised, you know. So the context, the problematic, the pertinence, the thing, why are the Portuguese collecting blood samples in the 1970s? I mean, this is a question that not necessarily a doctor asks, you know, perhaps. I think it's so obvious that perhaps, okay. But so they participate, historians, and so you have delivery of stories that are more complex, that have been corrected, and this is a work in progress, so it's not going to end. It's huge work. That's something that I think that in debates doesn't pass. I mean, this is an incredible work to document or redocument, resignify is the term I use, all these specimens and objects. I think that in Portugal, there has been indeed some good initiatives recently, and I think there are one or two. For example, I think the Padrão dos Descobrimentos, which is a small museum belonging to the municipality of Lisbon, which is a difficult monument, you know, it's in the middle of, in front of Jerónimos. It's a monument built during the Estado Novo, so during the dictatorship of Salazar, with all the, you know, the heroes of the Portuguese expansion. They are there, you know, and inside there's a museum. This museum has been problematizing colonialism with objects, you know, with collections, sometimes our collections, because they ask us a lot. And they've been doing a wonderful job. And there are many other examples of opening up to both different experts and also the communities. I think so. You're right. But what do you mean in Spain? I've been reading in El País, there's debates about colonialism and stuff. There was a paper, an article by this guy, what's his name? I forgot, about the Museum of the Americas in Madrid and so on. There was something, right? There's been things.
I'm not familiar with the article you are mentioning, Marta, but your call for attention to the community of historians, I think is essential, as you say, but not just historians in Europe, but also colonials in the former colonies to reconstruct another histories, no? In that sense.
Exactly. That's, I forgot to say that, but obviously when I was mentioning historians, I was mentioning there is in museums, there is there's actually a good I don't know if I have it here. I think I do. I don't know if I have, yeah, there is this. For me, it was a very important book. Do you see it?
The Metabolic Museum.
Yes, and it's about interesting experiences of artists from the communities of origin, providing perspectives, and by that enriching significances and stories about objects. So contemporary artists from the communities of origin, and it's an example from the Museum of Ethnography in Frankfurt. It's a kind of a small book, so it can be read. So when I mentioned historians, I obviously disregarded or did not mention, because I was trying to focus on, the skills of historians. But there has been an incredible, diverse scholarship entering the museum and contributing to this thickness of significances of colonial collections. Artists are one, anthropologists, archaeologists from the communities of origin, and historians and so on. So absolutely, yeah, that has been, and museums are, I never found a museum that didn't want to do this, okay?
Yes.
It's, yeah.
And perhaps your point of taking into account the local communities will also allow to reconstruct another histories of the active scientific practices developed by the people of that time. No, for instance, I'm thinking in collectors, in the people catching the animals, in the people measuring roads, constructing the railways. No, so these invisible
but
histories.
It's true, I agree, but that is not specifically colonial, in the sense that we, as historians, we were already interested in retrieving secondary practices, right? The students, and so in Western, so to speak, history of science, we were already interested in retrieving all that, the invisible, the practitioners, the preparators, so it's just an application to the field of colonial missions and so on. So absolutely, that's incredibly important too. Yeah.
Yes, so there is still a lot of work to do, no? A lot of things to decide.
Incredible. It's infinite. It's just crazy. And for us, who just, it was just 5 years ago that we received these collections. We were not, you have not seen them when you were there. The collections were not there, and so it changed completely our museum.
So I don't know if there is if there is more questions. All the people is invited. Yes, please. People
I see a lot of Portuguese. I see a lot of Portuguese. Don't you want to help me and kind of give me some comments? No, they're kind of shy.
No. So in that case, we are close to
well,
the
end.
I
really loved, again, it was so nice to receive this invitation, because I have an incredible admiration for your work, and I crossed paths with everyone, some more than others. We've been together in Brazil, we've been together, in Portugal, and we've been in so many fights and struggles for, the scientific collections, mostly collections of instruments, but also, the under the radar like yours here in the laboratory. If it wasn't for you, Ignacio, we would never know that collection of the Alfândega. It's incredible, and it's sources. It's just providing sources, making them available, also raising awareness to the institution. The institution became aware because somebody from Spain, a historian, came and would show the interest. So it's all about helping institutions to make things accessible, and sometimes it's not very difficult.
This was possible in part because of your help, and also because all the energy of the Portuguese community of historian of science working for many decades on the field. And we are the ones who are really glad for your attention and your talk. I don't know if Josep wants to say another closing words, or just say thank you again.
No, I think this is just. I think there should be more seminars about this topic, because there's so many nuances, so many angles. Science Empire, you know, collections, our collections fit, and so I think that
Yes.
I should, you know, encourage you to
Yes.
do more about this, you know.
Yes.
I want to talk more about this, but it's not. Although there's too much, but there is not so much, you know, about the issues of science and scientific collections. And for example, this thing of archives, still very embryo. There is ICA, the International Council of Archives, the equivalent of ICOM, has a database of displaced archives. But I think that it's incredible what once we start looking into archives, imagine correspondence between officials and so on, and what should go back to countries of origin. It's just incredible, the things that are in the metropole and should be restituted in terms of archives. It's just I wasn't prepared for that.
Mhm. So we will follow the debate and also your publication on that. We will expect that.
Yeah, I'm taking notes. It's still very, as you see, still very. I mean, there's so many open questions, but hopefully, you know, talking with more colleagues, these things will become clearer, and that's what we're here for. Okay.
Excellent, excellent, and many thanks, Marta, for your seminar. And I think we can close if you agree. And many thanks also to all the people assisting to the seminar. And please be.
Thank you all. Some are friends. I see lots of friends.
Mhm.
I see
Yes.
lots of friends. Thank you for being here, and thank you again, Joseph and Ignacio and Alphonse. I know he's not there, but he's somewhere.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and everyone. Bertomeu, I saw everyone is here. All
Yes. Yes.
friends. Okay.
Yes. So we can close here, at least from the point from the formal point of view. Y apenas ya quería ya voltar a decir que muito obrigado, Marta, que é sempre un placer, que espero que estejas bem.
Yeah, thank you so much. Obrigada. Beijinho muito grande, and I hope to see you in Lisbon one of these days.